When you're exploring the vast library of videos that is YouTube, what happens when you come across a video essay about something that you enjoy that has words like bad, terrible, and even failure in the title? I'm willing to bet you're a little confused and upset at the very notion of something you enjoy being considered a failure. And while I do believe that certain content creators do farm for hate clicks, or try to gather an audience who dislikes that particular subject, at some point you do have to consider that maybe the person talking about this subject actually enjoyed the content in question, and is now asking you to listen to them while they vent their frustrations. Maybe they liked that certain something at a certain point in time, but now that opinion has changed. I did like Genshin Impact when it first released, and still enjoyed it in the subsequent months that followed. But then, something happened. After the game's 1-year anniversary, opinions began to shift, and a good chunk of people started to leave. Now, this was mostly due to Genshin's core gameplay loop, and at the time I wasn't particularly bothered by it, although if you ask me now, it's something that I'm very concerned about. But that's a separate discussion for another day. No, my major problems with the game wouldn't come until a couple months later, when the second act of Genshin story quest came to a close. I realized that there were massive problems with the Inazuma, which, to be transparent, a couple content creators had already covered at the time. But the community as a whole hadn't realized that it wasn't just Inazuma, but it was the story as a whole, and how it was being told to its audience. And it was here that the major issues with Genshin Impact had become all too clear to me. It first began when I played through Ganyu's story quest. Ganyu was one of the first limited 5 stars that I ever got excited for, and I waited with bated breath for her release. And that's when it happened. I, like everyone else, thoroughly enjoyed Cryo Amber. Shout out to those of you who still remember that joke. So, after leveling her up and playing around with her abilities, I set my sights on her story quest, and, truth be told, I couldn't be more excited. Ganyu is thousands of years old and had fought alongside Zhongli during the Archon War, so what on earth could they be planning for her story quest? Were we going to learn about her childhood with Cloud Retainer? What was the worst battle she had ever been a part of? Did she lose anybody special during that time? Or did she ever take a life and regret it after the fact? All of these questions and more would not be answered. Instead, what we are given is a lackluster story that feels more like anime filler than anything else. This was the very first crack that had begun to form that would eventually break the illusion of Genshin Impact's story. Although I have heard that Acts 3 and 4 are far better than what we got previously, that the land of Inazuma was just a fluke, an outlier in a sea of otherwise great storytelling. And I agree that improvements have been made, but in my opinion, some of these are just minor adjustments, and overall do not fix the bigger issue with the Archon quests that we are still seeing play out. And so I should get around to talking about Act 3, Sumeru, but I can't exactly get to the thick rainforests that we find our traveler exploring at the start just yet, because last time I did reference a story that had been told outside the game itself. In fact, the story had been written before any of us had ever pressed play to begin our journey for the very first time. History, backstory, and the understanding of a character. These can all be found within the pages of an online comic for Genshin Impact, a comic which I referenced in my previous video, and now I think it's time we talk a little bit about it. For the purposes of this video though, I won't be going over the prologue. Chapter 1 begins with the Fatui. Why am I not surprised? They have organized a meeting with Diluc, as well as his adopted brother Kaya. Also in this meeting is Seamus, Barbara's father. The wiki states that he's Jean's father as well, which is weird because I could have sworn the two of them had 2 different fathers, but whatever. The Fatui are trying to gather support in Mondstadt. However, the Knights are not willing to budge. They know the Fatui aren't to be trusted. It also doesn't help that one of your leaders also looks like a freaking psychopath. This is the Doctor, by the way. I suspect that the reason he looks so different is because the developers couldn't find a way to integrate that mask into the game, so they told the writers to come up with something else. And just you wait, what they came up with was rather fun, let's just say. Anyways, they're evil, and Diluc, Kaya, and Seamus know that they're evil, so the meeting is adjourned. And this brings us to the next part in our story, which is the introduction to a very important character, Collei. Now, the reason why Collei is so important for this part of the story is because of how closely she is intertwined with the Fatui and the Sumeru story arc. We first encounter her at the Mondstadt gates where she fucking murders people? I mean, they're just Nesnayan diplomats, so it's not that big of a deal. She then runs into Amber and their adventure begins, along with a ton of fan art. When meeting Collei for the first time, Amber, with nothing better to do, because Kaya ditched her, decides to teach Collei how to fly. And as the story continues, Amber tries to help the Knights uncover a Fatui plot. All the while, Cole is still somewhat reserved and on guard, and so finally decides to take Cole to Ludiar Pastum, a Mondstadt event that I feel like Hoyoverse just straight up forgot about. It's been like 3 or 4 years. When are we going to get it? And it's here where I've gotten to the reason why I wanted to talk about the comic in the first place, Cole and her trauma. This context is left out of the main quest, and that's why I wanted to address the comic, but even it's not perfect. Despite having important information within its pages, some of those pages are missing. That's right, visiting the official website, you can read the comic for free, but the last few chapters are still missing. You have to visit a separate website to see the whole thing. To be clear, this isn't the biggest blunder Hoyoverse has ever done, but it's still an oversight. But enough about the comic for now. Let's get back to the Traveler and Paimon. When we first entered Sumeru, we met the Forest Rangers. Well, after being rescued from a dream, because we may have inhaled too many fumes. It's here that the Traveler and Paimon meet Tignari and his apprentice Cole, and thus our journey begins.
But before I talk about the opening act of Sumeru, I'd like to make another small detour and discuss how each individual chapter to that storyline opens up. The Traveler and Paimon just go. There's no fanfare, no lead-in, nor anything. It's just Paimon telling us, hey, do you want to go to the next area? And that's it. Now, if you're binging the game, I suppose that's fine. You barely notice it at all. But to literally everybody else, well, it's the most jarring out-of-place thing we've ever heard. We could spend months without a new update to the story, and then, all of a sudden, we just decide to go to the next region? Of course, the most obvious in-game explanation is that the map hasn't been updated yet. But story-wise, this almost makes no sense. Like, why do we spend 6 to 8 months just sitting around? What I'm trying to get at is that the story makes almost no effort to try to make things more natural going into the next chapter. I know that it would take some effort to do so, but it's really not as hard as you would think. I mean, it's not like there's some in-game plot device that the players visit on a daily basis that could, in theory, be the catalyst for all of our entries going into the new regions.
Ad Astra Abyssosk.
Oh, wait, that's right. We're part of the Adventurers Guild. You know, the guild responsible for going on adventures and exploring new areas. To add on to the story, we could have different playable characters introducing us to the new regions. A good example of this would be Lisa. She is, after all, a student from the academia, but sadly she's not utilized for this potential. But it would have made more sense for us to seek out Lisa's help for getting into Sumeru. But Greenline, Lisa can't help us because she's too busy working and can't leave her home.
Are you sure about that?
Oh yeah? Because it's quite clear in this scene that she can in fact leave. You know, for as much flack as I gave it, the introduction to Inazuma's story quest was pretty well done. It seemed that there was actually thought put into it. But now, as it stands, it just seems that the Traveler just stumbles into the new storyline of Sumeru on a whim. Alright, but enough about that. Let's move on to Tighnari and Cole. When the Traveler wakes up from their drug-induced dream, we meet Cole, who's been watching over the Traveler as they recover. And soon after that, we meet her teacher, Tighnari. And then we are asked to clean up the Statue of the Seven as payment for the Traveler's hospital bill. Afterwards, we are treated to some backstory for Cole. She mentions being well acquainted with Amber and has known about our affiliations with the Knights since our arrival into the camp. The young Forest Ranger trainee then treats the Traveler and Paimon to her specialty.
Pita Pockets!
What are you gonna pick? Hot Pocket!
And finally, it's here that we are given a terrible rendition of post-traumatic stress disorder.
It's time for some primordial wrath! No! Don't touch me!
This scene is terrible. What it's trying to convey and what it's actually conveying are two separate things entirely. I got some pushback in my failure essay about being too nitpicky in regards to animations. Those comments usually pointing out how it would be too hard to incorporate all these things into a phone. Because, despite being available on PC and PlayStation, the primary player base chooses to play on mobile. And look, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that when you look at it from the perspective of a company trying to market their game, specifically a gacha. But try to understand at this point, it's negatively affecting the game's story as a whole. Just look at how this scene is portrayed. It's clunky and cut so you don't have to see the models in frame. However, in doing so, you've lost almost all emotion and only the voice actors can help you salvage any part of it. Cole is traumatized, but you can barely tell because Hoyoverse couldn't be bothered to give the animators the time that they would need to animate the scene properly. Her eyes should be wide open and the model itself
itself should be shaking from the stress alone, but nothing like that here is given to the audience. And you want to know what's sad? I realized that this was happening in Star Rail as well, because when criticizing Genshin Impact last time, I failed to fully explain why not having good animations in these specific scenes is a detriment to the overall story. In the Star Rail event, A Foxy and Tale of the Haunted, we meet the shy and timid Huohua. During the event, we spend time learning about her backstory and learn that she was bullied throughout her childhood, even by her own parents. But despite the heartbreaking story that was unfolding before me, I couldn't make out a single expression coming from Huohua because the camera was turned away from her face.
Everyone always leaves me. I don't want to be alone.
And it's the exact same with Cole. Paimon just goes up to her, and I can only assume tries to tickle her. I say we can only assume is because we don't see anything. The camera is pointed away from Cole and Paimon, so we can't confirm exactly what happened. And this is one of the major issues with this game. This game tells, but doesn't show. It breaks the fundamental rule of visual storytelling. Let me explain. You could tell someone, the chicken crossed the road, or the chicken scurried across the blazing asphalt as the rushing of mechanical monsters had stopped. With the first sentence, you know that the chicken crossed the road, but little else. What about the second sentence? Well, I told you that the chicken scurried across the blazing asphalt. So now you might have pictured the chicken using its short legs to run about the pavement, as scurry is used to describe short, quick steps. Blazing asphalt describes that it might have been late spring or summertime. And finally, mechanical monsters refers to vehicles that have stopped, possibly due to a traffic light. But Genshin is a video game, and not a novel. It's supposed to tell you its story through its visuals and voice acting, but relies so heavily on the latter and not the former that it hinders the whole experience. And this happened yet again during the Sabzeruz Festival. After the Traveler leaves Paimon to investigate, the Traveler doesn't return for some time, and leaves Paimon all alone. Only for the two of them to be reunited the next day, and Paimon emotionally embraces her companion. But we don't see it. The game does nothing more than smash the two models together. The game cannot be bothered to show you Paimon holding on to the Traveler for dear life and crying in their arms. The first time I saw this, it actually took me a minute to actually figure out what had happened. It's incredibly lazy for such an emotional moment, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I can't exactly get to the Sabzeruz Festival without talking about the inner workings of Sumeru and its relationship with its Archon. After leaving the forest, the Traveler and Paimon make their way to the main city. Once they arrive, they are given a device that links them up to the Akasha. Think of it like Sumeru's own internet, a system that links all the adults in the region, a hive mind of almost limitless information. Now that the Traveler has access to Teyvat's World Wide Web, they begin to ask questions about the region's Archon, to no avail. And when they ask around, nobody can seem to answer our questions about their own god. Up to this point, each region of Teyvat has held up their Archon with high respect and reverence. In Mondstadt, the people sing praises to the god of Anemo, despite the fact that Venti is mostly absent from his duties and mostly leaves with the protection of the well-being of the citizens to the Knights of Favonius. In Liyue, the contracts of Rex Lapis are upheld, and the people still speak of the Lord of Geo in high regard. Across the pond in Inazuma, the Raiden Shogun is feared and admired by the subjects that she rules over. But once we get to Sumeru, things change. The Archon of this region is in fact not loved, but is despised by all except for a few. And so, after a few scenes and meeting a few key characters, the Traveler discovers the underground following of Sumeru's present god. It's kind of sad, actually, because after seeing several countries love and worship their Archons, this small gathering of people that make up no more than what you would see at a small convention puts into perspective of how removed this region really is from its deity. But nevertheless, the people that remain are still happy. Kusanali's birthday is fast approaching, and this year in particular, they're going all out with the help of a secretive benefactor to set the stage for the best Sabzeruz Festival anyone has ever seen. A day that I'm sure some people would wish would go on forever. The Sabzeruz Festival is by no means perfect, but with what it has to convey, the game does a decent job. When the first day begins, the Traveler and Paimon meet up with Dunyarzad, an NPC who initially introduced us to the Archon's following. She's been waiting a long time to take part in the festival, and knows quite a bit to guide the Traveler around the different stalls and tell us about each one. After a little while though, Dunyarzad realizes she's forgotten something. As we head back to retrieve it, we are ambushed by a group of enemies, but are thankfully saved by Dunyarzad's bodyguard, Dia. Dea. Dunyazad, the Traveler, and Paimon make their escape, and after a little while are joined by Dea. She was able to fight them off, only sustaining a small injury, and after a bit more talking, we finally return to the festival, only to find out that it's being shut down by the Academia, and shortly after that, the day sadly comes to a close. And so the following day, the Traveler meets up with Dunyazad, who's been waiting a long time to take part in the festival. Huh? In 1993, Columbia Pictures released the film Groundhog Day, about a weatherman named Phil Connors portrayed by Bill Murray. The character Phil has to make his way to Puxatawney, Pennsylvania for an annual coverage of Groundhog Day. But then, something strange happens after Groundhog Day. It's still Groundhog Day, and so is the next day, and the next day, and then the next day, and even the day after that. Now, the film is mostly a romantic comedy, but between you and me, I could see it being a horror film. Having to relive the same day over and over, I would think that would make anyone go insane. And sure, this works for a film and in a book, but I don't see how you would ever turn this into a video game. And yet, Hoyoverse did it. As I stated before, it is by no means perfect, but the fact that the game had to convey multiple days, not to mention dozens upon dozens of scenarios within a couple hours, I do think it did a pretty good job. Firstly, I'd like to talk about the candy stall run by Vihar. By the first day, the Traveler is completely unaware of what candy lies inside each container, even though a few might have gotten lucky and guessed the right answer. But by the end of this encounter, the game automatically picks the right container for you because you will already know the correct answer. Secondly, the cafe scene. Genshin could have gone and had us play through multiple routes of this story. However, doing so would have meant players would have spent multiple hours playing through this particular part of the story, and I don't think anybody was willing to do that. So instead, they took us to the cafe and played this scene.
Paimon also gets the impression that we've been here many times, even though we aren't regulars.
What this does is convey to us, the audience, the fact that we have not been playing through 4 or 5 days, as we initially thought at this point. No, in fact we've been doing this for quite possibly over 50, or maybe even 100. Despite all that I've said, I need to give credit where it's due. I think the Sabzeruz Festival is really well done. As we continue, we are introduced to a character named Nahida, who is totally the Archon. It's weird because I feel like the game tries to treat her as just some mysterious person that we encounter. But 99% of people playing the game knew exactly who this was. And so, to make a long story short, the baby Archon really knows what's going on, but doesn't tell us because the game wants us to suffer. However, the Traveler does eventually figure out that we are in fact not in a time loop, but instead are inside a dream. I do think this is super clever. Despite this though, there is one glaring flaw. A lack of creativity. Because ultimately this boils down to Hoyoverse not spending enough money. And look, I know I've argued this point before, so let me elaborate. Let's look at this clip from the Sabzeruz Festival.
Mute puppets rather than people. I can't sense any human presence.
Try to remember what this is. This is a dream sequence. Think of all the nutty and amazing things they could do with this idea in mind. But look at this scene. It's blurry and hard to make out. And we don't even get to experience it firsthand. It's just a brief cutscene, and it's not even fully animated at that. I strongly believe that this game could be advertised by its story. However, half the time, the scenes are just half-assed due to budget cuts. I mean, this entire story arc is giving off major Inception vibes. Could you imagine if they made an entire level where you could walk around on the walls or the ceiling? Hey, wait a fucking minute!
And try. It worked. You really can walk up walls.
The only major problem I can think of is that they didn't fully commit to killing Dunyazad, who I should probably talk about next. Back when I first created my Genshin video, I ended up discussing with someone in the comment section about Tepe, Dunyazad, and the nature of the non-playable characters. During Inazuma's story quest, we met a character named Tepe, a low-ranking member of the Resistance that was eager to prove himself and to make his way up the ladder in order to become a high-ranking officer. And while he did become an officer, his future unfortunately came to an abrupt end. Tepe had taken the power of a delusion, a Fatui instrument that drains its life force from its user. This ultimately killed Tepe. The game treats this like a big deal, but I would argue that in the eyes of most players it didn't really matter all that much. And it's the same with Dunyazad. But why is that? Well, part of the problem is that we don't spend enough time compared to the playable characters. Once they've played their parts, that's it. We don't see them again. Apart from Dunyarzad showing up in a side quest or two, they're gone. They will have faded away from the consciousness of most fans, with the exception of a few hardcore players. Secondly, there's a distinct gap between the designs of the playable characters and the NPCs. In Genshin, the side characters get a downgrade that is so noticeable to the player base, this immediately tells us that these characters are just not as important. Outside of a handful of characters, Timaeus, Catherine, and Madame Ping, is there any NPC that you distinctly remember? Look, if you think I'm just being mean or hyperbolic for the sake of it, look at these reactions.
You are interested in Lesser Lord Kusanali?
I'm also interested in who you are.
She's really cute. Hello.
Ooh, mommy! Hubba hubba, ooga.
Stand down, Dia.
This should be more than enough to convince you that nobody ever really cared about Dunyarzad. Some care is given, sure, but as a whole, the player base cares more about the playable characters. The minute a character with a unique model shows up on screen, several things are going through their head. Look how amazing they look! I wonder how they're going to affect the story. And of course, what's their playstyle like? And how can I fit them into a team? And to be clear, this isn't a flaw, it's by design. But for characters like Tepe and Dunyarzad, it affects them negatively for playing important roles in the main story. All Hoyoverse has to do is give these characters a unique model. Yes, it's going to take more time and resources, but it's going to have a better effect on the story moving forward. Now, before I move on to the conclusion of the Sumeru chapter, I'd like to briefly talk about Acts 3 and 4, as well as the importance of pacing. I know I've been giving a lot of criticism towards Sumeru's Archon quest, but a massive improvement that was implemented in this story quest was its pacing. This might sound like small praise, but try to understand that one of the reasons Inazuma's story quest was so bad was partly due to the fact that it was rushed. Concepts and ideas had to be glossed over for the sake of getting to the finish line. But in Sumeru it feels balanced and well thought out. From the time we first arrive in Aura Village and meeting Candace, to the exploration of an ancient tomb and discovering the secrets of Elazar. Now, this isn't perfect by any means. Genshin still suffers from massive lore dumps hidden with some in-game items. That being said, giving the story this much room to breathe is a welcome addition. Alright, let's move on to the conclusion. Wait, what's that? You want me to talk about Scaramouche? No, I don't want to. But I'll tell you what, I just created a Patreon, so if you decide to join, I may consider a standalone video for him. Or, if we can get this video to, I don't know, 20k likes, I'll make a video. Alright, let's address the other harbinger in the room, the Doctor. He's kinda boring. First of all, I was expecting something more based off the manga. He has this cool mask and a crazy smile. I thought he looked pretty cool, all things considered. But apparently, this is just a variant of him. Get a load of this. The Doctor can segment himself from different points in his life and make copies. No, I need more Kingdom Hearts in my Genshin Impact. Please, for the love of God, do not take arguably one of the worst concepts from the world's most convoluted video game series and put it into your story. Not to mention his face is devoid of any design. Instead of making a unique face for our antagonist, it feels like Genshin just decided to use an NPC's face and slapped a mask on top of it. But okay, enough of my criticisms that are only skin deep in regards to Dottore. Instead, I have something more concrete. Our dear Doctor has been built up since the game started. That is, if you read the manga. He's mainly the one responsible for Cole's current mental state. So, here I am thinking that we were going to get a heated confrontation between Tainari and the Doctor. Instead, Dottore wants to talk to Apasia, the woman from the beginning of the quest. She's been having visions of Scaramouche. Seems like a waste of time, but sure, why not, Doctor? I can't tell you how excited I was for these two to interact for the first time, but it's a complete disappointment. There's no mention of Cole, despite the fact that she should be there at this moment. Yes, there are a few reasons why she shouldn't be there logically within the frame of the story. However, there are workarounds, and they could have easily put her in. This could, in theory, complete her character arc. Standing up to one of her abusers could do wonders for her character. And if things get too dicey, you could always bring in Tainari, who would protect his student and chew out the Doctor. They could even throw hands. I would love to see a fight between these two. And for anybody saying that wouldn't make sense, should remember that Tainari has been helping Cole recover physically and emotionally. He has every right to be angry at the Doctor. All this scene does is remind me of a high school debate. Because that's exactly what it sounds like. It sounds like teenagers arguing. What I really wanted to see was a physical fight between Tainari and the Doctor, for the Forest Ranger to take action against a cruel and evil man. But we can't have everything, can we? Towards the climax, the Traveler is able to sneak into the academia with the help of a scholar named Al-Haytham. In a really clever move, the traveler is deliberately captured and put into a cell. From there, we are able to get into contact with Nahida. To be honest, most of the scenes that play out from here on are pretty good, from Nilou's distraction to Sino's confrontation against the sage. I'm not opposed to giving out compliments to the story. In my opinion, there's genuinely good written moments in the Sumeru questline. I have my critiques, to be sure, even though some of them are just nitpicks, like the stupid naming scheme of the Archons. First, we have Venti in Barbados. After that, it was Zhongli, Rex Lapis, and Morax. Following him, we have Baal and Raiden Shogun. But Baal was the former Archon, and her sister, A, is actually the one in the position. But of course, the Shogun has another name. Beelzebul is her demon name. It's not confusing, it's just convoluted, and it can catch you completely off guard. Like when Scaramouche called Nahida Boar. I was so confused. It's because the writers have too many names for the Archons. Anyways, tangent aside, we fight Mighty Morphin Mommy issues, Nahida reveals that she trapped Scaramouche in a Genjutsu, and the Traveler gets one of the coolest titles in the game. Yeah, being an honorary knight and a squad captain is pretty cool and all, but being the first sage feels like it gives actual status for the main character in Sumeru. Too bad nobody calls Aether Rulumin that. I've seen people get a lot of credit towards this point in the game, specifically the brief cutscene showing the characters trying to formulate a plan to defeat Scaramouche. I've seen people call it like an Avengers moment, which is weird because I feel like they would have to be there to live up to that name, but they're not. The game just shows a brief cutscene of all the characters supposedly feeding the Traveler information. What sucks is that in the previous scenes there was plenty of teamwork. Nilou's distraction is previously mentioned, and the diversion that was set up by the Eremites. It works so much better than whatever the hell this is.
I've asked them to help you find a way to defeat the false god. Now, all of Sumeru's wisdom is at your disposal.
Look, I get it. It's trying to convey teamwork, but it's incredibly sloppy. And the sad part is, this wouldn't even take a lot of work to fix. All you would need to do, theoretically, is voiceover. Nilou could be telling us how to avoid attacks by fluidly moving like a dancer on the battlefield. Al-Haytham could give us information about the mech's attacks. And maybe a few background characters that work on the machine could help us. But like I said, these are all just minor things, and they don't ruin the overall story of Sumeru too much. Overall, if I was grading it, I would give it a B. If I felt like I needed to be extra strict, I'd give it a C+. Well, Greenline, that doesn't sound too bad. That sounds like a far cry of a failure than it used to be. It's better now. Yeah, before the story had finished, I thought so too. Until I reached the end. Spoiler alert, it may have soared to new heights, but it didn't stick the landing. I remember someone once saying, the ending is paramount, implying that a story, no matter how great or mediocre, the most important aspect is the conclusion. Well, I don't fully agree, I do understand it. Just look at Game of Thrones. For many years, people praised it, and season after season, it had acquired critical success, until its finale. While I'm sure people continue to still watch the series, I know for a fact many people are still soured by the ending. It still affects the whole series despite being a small portion of the show overall. You could write one of the greatest stories of all time, but if the ending sucks, it can ruin the entire experience. We need to talk about Irminsul. Irminsul is the repository for all the information and memories of Teyvat, which are collected via the ley lines. At least that's how the wiki describes it. After defeating Mama's boy, the Traveler, Paimon, and Nahida make their way to see Rukkhadevata's final memory. What we end up finding is heartbreaking. It is for me anyways. But not in the way that you would think. See, we end up meeting Rukkhadevata, and she ends up telling us that the Tree of Irminsul must be cleansed in order for it to fully heal. To do so, Rukkhadevata is going to remove herself from Irminsul, which will leave no trace of her, including every memory. Wait, what? Let me get this straight. By erasing Rukkhadevata from Irminsul, everybody in the world, except for the Traveler, forgets her completely. It wraps up the entire story and conflict in Sumeru in a single scene. It also erases any semblance of gratification and closure the player might have had for the characters they've just spent the past several hours with, especially Nahida. The amount of abuse and neglect that she was put through was going to take years to heal, but with the Traveler and the other companions, we were going to get through it. Slowly, but surely, we were going to restore Sumeru's faith back in its Archon. Just kidding! We don't have any time for that. We need to wrap up this shit and move on to Fontaine. You wanted a nicely paced resolution to the conflict? Go suck a dick because you get none of those things.
You get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.
Why am I still talking about this? Why do I keep dogpiling on Genshin Impact? Because at one point, I cared. Because there was a time I wanted to know what was going to happen next. But now, I don't. I don't care, not even a little. I remember the days when I was excited to see what was going to happen next with Zhongli and the secrets he was hiding. At one point I was excited to hear about Alice and the Hexen Circle, but they seem so far away now that it doesn't even matter. Just be patient and wait, they say. But I did wait. I've waited for 4.5 years now. And for what? It's not as if I wanted all the answers at once. What I wanted is for these answers to be properly spaced out and delivered to us, the audience. It's not as if the story can't add new elements with each new installment. Skirk is a prime example of this. Her introduction opens the door to so many new avenues the story could take. This proves the story can keep moving forward. It's not going to just suddenly stop when we have answers to some of the questions we've been wanting since the beginning. If we were suddenly given the majority of Dainsleif's backstory, the main quest wouldn't just be over and done with. There are other plot points beyond that. Just stop giving us breadcrumbs and give us a slice. Because it's not like we're asking for the entire loaf. And please, for the love of God, put some voice acting in the side quests. Because some of these are unbearably long. Just look at the R&R quest line. It's like, what, 4 hours? That's an incredibly long time to expect some players to pay attention to the story while they're just reading the dialogue. Wait, what? Excuse me? It's 11 hours long? You were right, guys. We need to put in a skip button. Till next time, guys.